No. We're just going to just wing it, figure it out.
See, we do this. We can talk about anything forever, right? Because we do this all the time.
That's the problem when I have people that have shows. I'm like, all right, like we need to make sure we have a hard stop at something, because if we don't, 3 hours goes by and you're like, shit, I forgot I had other things I needed to do.
Right. We'll be good. We'll be good.
Yeah, cool. All right, I will mute us and we will get started.
Okay.
Welcome to Run with Purpose. This is episode number 121. And for those of you that are new to the show, my name is Flores, and I'm so very glad that you found this podcast. Would love if you would subscribe. And as always, you can reach out to me on all the socials everywhere at flores.run. Hope everyone is having a great week. This week, we have a guest. It's been a while since I've had a guest, and I'm very, very excited for our guest today. I'll let her kind of do her introduction of everything, but we've been kind of connecting for the last... I think it was before I moved from Minnesota. We kind of started talking, and then I was just like, oh, wait, I'm leaving Minnesota. So sorry, we can't have a Minnesotian podcast. But Kelly, thanks for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. We don't really know what we're going to talk about today. We're just going to kind of chat for a little while. We said just before we started recording that because we both have podcasts, this could just go off the rails and talk about 50 things for 3 hours. No, we're not going to make your ears bleed.
Not going to do that to you. No.
But yeah, Kelly, if you want to just introduce yourself and kind of plug all of your things so people know where to find you and connect with you.
Sure. So my name is Kelly, and I host a podcast called On Our Best Behavior. I started that with my son, and I can go into that full story for you. You can find me on Instagram. My handle, since I was, 20 years old, is at Crazy Beautiful Kelly. Otherwise, you can find the podcast On Our Best Behavior on TikTok, on Instagram. We have a Facebook page. So however you search On Our Best Behavior, you'll stumble across us.
Perfect. Yeah. So we'll have that all in the show notes, so you guys will be able to easily click and do all that stuff. But yeah, I want to kind of jump in right to that of kind of the background behind the podcast and the reason behind it. So the podcast is with you and your son, and it's fantastic and it's hilarious. I was dying laughing. I think the one I listened to on the plane ride home was the menstrual cycles, I think. And your son was just, he was not interested. He was just like, I don't really want to talk about this, but it was hilarious.
Yeah, I force him into life. Like, I feel like he's going to eventually figure things out. And sometimes in school settings is where we unfortunately learn those things. And so I just am have a very open parent style. And if something comes up, like, we're talking about it as a family. So, and I want him, he's a boy. So does he understand how the female body works? No. Does he understand why maybe girls are moody in high school? No. So I'm just there to kind of help him understand, hey, we're all going through our own things, and it's not what you're going through. Yeah. Girls versus boys and puberty. Poof. There's a lot going on both ends, and nobody knows what's going on with the other one.
Right.
So our podcast was born because in the pandemic of COVID, we watched a lot of survival TV shows in that time. For some reason, there was Alone was on, The Last Alaskan was on, and we were watching those shows. And he's like, Mom, I think it would be awesome if we could just get dropped off in the woods somewhere and see how long we could survive. And at that time, I'm like, well, I'm going back to work now, and I can't really take off an undeterminate amount of time until we survive, which, probably would only survive not that long, but
I mean,
trying to be optimistic, maybe it could be months. So anyway, I'm like, that's not in the cards. Of course, he really wanted to be a YouTuber. So this was our compromise. I'm like, we could do a podcast. You could start there. And he's like, sure. Okay. So I did research for a long time because I am not techie. I do not work in IT. I work in healthcare. And I call the IT person every time the computer doesn't work. That's me. Restart your computer. So I'm pretty proud of what we have accomplished because I've done it all on my own. So, and he's helped me along the way too, but I mean, I drive the ship. Let's be real.
You're the star. He's the sidekick. We understand how this works out.
I try to give him equal credit, but he shows up. At the end of the day, he shows up.
That's all you can really ask for in a co-host, right? Is just, hey, show up, put your headphones on, and let's do the thing. Let's talk for a little bit.
Yeah. And it's good for our relationship because it really gives us this is the thing we do together. Yeah. And this is the time where, as a 14-year-old boy, he is a man of not a lot of words. So how was school today? It was fine. What'd you learn today? I don't know. So this kind of gets him going,
Yeah. And
as a podcaster, and actually in one of your recent episodes that I listened to, hit home with me the just do it. Sometimes when you do something that you're communicating with people or trying to connect with people, you have to be on. And so sometimes if you're not in that on mode, it's really hard to get into it. And so like you had said on your previous episode, sometimes you just have to do it angry, do it sad, do it whatever. And it is going to make it better. And it does always work out. And you might capture moments in that mindset that you normally wouldn't. Yeah. So I think it's good. It's good for us.
Yeah. I love that. Cause this idea too, when you talked about the open parenting aspect of really wanting to make sure that he knows what's going on in the world. Right. And knows real things hey, if you have a question about it, let's talk about it. Let's figure out what this is about. And to use even the podcast as a platform, I can imagine that you have other families that probably listen with their kids and that sort of thing to kind of do the exact same thing, right? To have this same feeling of, hey, I'm connecting with my kid in this way, and we're both listening, we're both learning about something. Do you have any experiences people reaching out, talking about that?
So, a lot of things I talk about, menstrual cycles and birth control. I work in women's health, so that's what I do. So I have a lot of knowledge about that. So people have reached out to me my entire life. One of my hopes for this podcast is that it would be an icebreaker for families to talk about more difficult topics. So I see young kids all the time that don't have parents they can talk to about things or wish they knew how to talk to their parents about these things. And then there's people who are very open with their kids. And my parents did a lot of things wrong with me. But one thing that I loved that they did is they were open. If you heard a word at school that you didn't know what it meant, ask us, and we're not going to shame you. We want you to know. So they were really good at, I did not live in a bubble at all.
Yeah.
So I just want that for McCoy. I think knowledge is power. And I did. He is here. I brought him. Hi.
He's a co-host to the co-host.
Yes. So that's kind of, what we do. And, I of course I wrote down so many things. And then, like we said, as podcasters, we just start talking and talking and talking. But we've talked about, as things come up in school, we started this when he was in 7th grade, so junior high. And I thought, this is when stuff really starts happening. Elementary school is pretty low key sheltered, I think. And then you go to junior high and you're meeting different kids, and kids have changed so much over the summer at this point. And so we've talked about things like, what's it like to start middle school, now high school? There were some situations that came up in school with bullying, food fights, kids vaping in the bathroom, school shooters was such a, it is still a big problem. Yeah. And so we've talked about what would you do if that happened? We've talked about ADHD and anxiety and depression, so many things that people go through that it's getting better at being normalized or talked about, but I think a lot of people, young kids especially, struggle not knowing what avenue to take or what to do about it. And they just think, oh, it's part of being a kid, or this is just who I am. Right.
There's all those taboo topics that they can't really talk to their parents about. And the parents really don't even know how to talk about it. To your point earlier, right? It's hopefully this kind of opens eyes, like, hey, just have these conversations. You may not know all the answers, but Google it, or find
and it's
find
okay
a resource.
to not know the answer. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's so often that I've talked about this a gazillion times on the podcast, but we limit ourselves because we just don't know the thing, or we're scared about the thing, or we're worried about the thing. And so then we don't even try to kind of break it down or see whatever's going on. And I think when you get like that with kids, I don't have kids, I'm not having kids. So it's always like, I'm going to give everyone the parenting advice right now. Listen to me, because I know what I'm talking about.
You know what? Good for you, because there's a lot of people who have too many kids. So thanks for helping the population.
Hey, you know what? It's my sacrifice that I'm giving to everyone else, that I don't have to deal with screaming children. After we were in Minnesota, my wife was a nanny and housekeeper of 5. So it was 5 under 5, and we lived in their basement. So after that, I'm like, man, if I didn't need birth control before, yes, we're good now. Sorry, mom and dad, when you're listening to this. But yeah, I think it's when you kind of bring up those topics and kind of bring things to light, it helps people understand, like, hey, we can have these conversations. We may not know all of the answers, but we can look at it together and figure this out. That part of the relationship thing has been interesting to me. How have you seen kind of your relationship with him kind of evolve through the podcast as he's getting older, right? Because usually what happens is teenagers, and then he gets in high school and he's like, I want nothing to do with mom. Right. But obviously you guys are recording episodes and you're talking about things. How did that relationship kind of like continue to evolve?
So I am very lucky, because he has never gotten to that I don't want anything to do with my mom point yet. He's good at, understanding, having his own independence, but still he's super respectful of me and my feelings. I'm very lucky. I know that could change at any minute. And I'd like to think that I am also very approachable for his friends. So his friends like to come over. I even have an older son who's a senior in high school, and him and his buddy they came over this last Saturday night, hung out with us. We played video games. So it's very rewarding to feel like you can be that person in their life that's an adult and knows the boundaries, but they still really trust you. And so I think, our relationship, I don't know if it's really evolved, but it's continued to be great. It's continued to be like, we can talk about anything. And there are some times where I have to say, you don't have to look at me. You don't have to respond. I know this is going to be weird for you, but I need to say this. And then it is awkward, and I can tell they don't know what to do or say. And so then I just start talking about something else completely different to help them move on.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, so I think it's been helpful in just maintaining our bond and continuing to talk about hard things that might be happening at school.
Yeah.
And most of the time it's pretty uneventful at school for him. So it's hard.
That was kind of my next thinking point along that, is kind of pulling that information out, right? Of like, when you're having these conversations, to keep that interaction where obviously certain topics are going to be more involved in conversation where others are not. How does the prep go before the episode? Because I always get, like, you've seen my note process. It's very bare, and it's not a lot. But when you're kind of like playing this game where you're pulling from people, sometimes you need a little bit more. So how does that look of like, hey, today we're going to talk about whatever, or is it he finds out when you guys start recording?
So I make notes throughout the week of anything that I think like, oh, this would be good for the podcast. And then I also ask him every day, when we're having our daily, like, how was school today? What did you do? What did you do in this class, that class? Who did you sit by? Did you meet anyone new today? Did anything happen? And most of the time it's like, no. But every once in a while, he'll come home and say, I have something for the podcast. Write this down.
Love that.
And so it is exciting that he does think about it sometimes. So we've been trying to do, like, he has to have one story or one topic for the podcast every time we do it. And then he always has to have a would you rather, because we just started out with would you rather was super hot at the time. And so now I just say, like, you have to bring one to the table every week. Yeah.
Love it. So. Yeah, 'cause I think the one I listened to on the plane, he was he was like back and forth on things like, would you rather, and he kept flipping between, I think it was, may have been like mashed potatoes and baked potato or something of that nature. And he kept going back and forth. And I was like, this is just hilarious to me. Cause I've had those conversations with like, when I used to lead youth groups for middle school and high school kids, where you're like having conversations and you're like, focus. We're here. Let's get this thing done. So it's just kind of funny to me.
He does have ADD, so he is all over the place. And so that's kind of, I think, not fun, but interesting to really capture that and, see how it is. But I catch myself, I do the same thing. I'll be like on a rant and then I'm on another rant and I'm like, oh, we have to get back to where we were. Yeah. I'm sure you know about that.
That was my episode that just came out today, actually, for everyone listening. Last week, it was the same thing. I was like, I started one track and then I just started, like, I had no notes. I was sitting on the couch back there with the holding the microphone going, let's see what happens. And 25 minutes of me just going all over the place, but it was fun. But yeah, I think it's the idea of kind of having the conversation and bringing up those topics, I think can be beneficial across the board with people, because again, those taboo topics that people feel like they don't have the answers to and that sort of thing. How do you handle, maybe there's a topic that you aren't familiar with? So obviously a lot of the women's health stuff and that sort of stuff, obviously that's your wheelhouse, you know that. But when you have topics that you aren't aware of or maybe just curious about, I'm always interested in how people go about learning those things, or at least trying to gather information. Because sometimes it can be on a podcast, you don't want to sound like the asshole that like, I know everything and like what I say is the gospel, right? But you also want to come semi-informed.
Yeah, you want to be relatable. And, there's sometimes I listen back to a podcast that I did and I'll be like, oh, I totally said that wrong. That's not right. But, you get like going and you're excited. So, yeah, but I've definitely done research on certain topics. We did like one time we did I don't think he thought this was nearly as cool as I did, but like an astrology birth chart. Okay. And so I had to do a lot of research on that because I didn't know, but I thought like, this is cool. And when I read his and I read mine, I'm like, this is us. This is for real. Let's tell people about it. He was just like, oh, Mom, I don't know about that, but sure.
That's funny.
Yeah, we've done. Yeah. And there's ones where he's totally clueless about it, but hopefully, he retains some of the stuff.
Yeah, I think that's.
And someday when I'm not here anymore, he'll always have this to listen back to us.
Yeah, I think that's super cool. Like to that point of having kind of a memory that outlives us, right? It's why most creative people do the creative things we do, and you see that throughout history, right? People end up being famous long after they're gone because people finally appreciated whatever the thing they were doing. And I think as creatives, that's what we always want to do, is put something out there that people will kind of resonate through time of like, hey, it might feel a little different based off of the time of life or who's listening to it when they listen to it. And I think that's super cool just from a family aspect, to be able to have those things to kind of look back. It's just like, watching old like VHS tapes, kids that are listening, VHS tapes. We had these big tapes that we had to, Blockbuster used to charge us when we didn't rewind them before we turned them back in. And Blockbuster. No. Just keep going back.
1 hour photo, like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to see what our photos look like. And they're all blurry. Somebody blinked.
Like, oh, now I only had 36 pictures to take. It's the ridiculous. I think one of the things that's interesting about that kind of format with your podcast is I think you can run into some possibly challenges in this ring. Obviously, you're saying the relationship's good and it's kind of just continued to grow, but there has to be some like challenging moments where you're just like, kid, I'm going to wring your neck in this situation, or just some disconnects there. I'd love to hear war stories.
Yeah. Well, so like you, I think, like, I don't do a lot of editing. So sometimes when he'll swear or say something that I think is like, you shouldn't say that, especially on the podcast, like I'll be like, then it is a little bit of a, like, you see that little parent-child relationship come out where I'm like, they can't do that. So it does happen on this podcast. And I just like, you know what? We are a real family and that does happen. So here it is.
Yeah. I love the authenticity of it.
And, you used to live in Minnesota and that's where we live. And so Dave Ryan from KWB has helped us a ton, and he has helped plug us, and he has kind of given me some insight on, what's good. And that was one of his things is when we started this podcast, he said, I'm really nervous because a lot of kids are going to be into that and then they fall off, or he goes to high school. Now this isn't important to him. He has other things going on. And, but we haven't had that happen yet. So we'll see how it goes. And I've also tried to evolve with having guests on more recently, just to kind of give him a break and not make it have to be his full-time thing.
Yeah. Cause that is tough to kind of make it the two of you, and every week it has to be something else. And we're kind of going through this. My old podcast, me and my buddy, that was our shtick. Is for, I think we only went like 65 episodes, but it was 65 straight weeks of every single week. We would show up at my house, or I'd show up at his house, and we'd process through the thing. And a couple of times we had guests, but more often than not, we didn't. And that, when we realized how much of a toll that took, of just like, hey, we got to do this every time. We're playing the same jokes. Like, we're playing reruns. How do we make this thing better? So when I started this podcast, I was like, hey, I'm going to do more guests. But then, during COVID, so easy to find guests because everyone was doing this. Everyone was doing this thing remote. Yeah. It made it a lot easier. But in the last year or so, it's been tough to find some interesting people and different stories that people are willing to share for a non-promotion standpoint. I'm sure you get these emails too, but I get all these emails of like authors or people that are like, they're promoters and stuff like that, want to be on the show. And I'm like, that's fine, but I'm not here to plug your new book. Like, if I don't think you're a cool person, I'm just not going to talk to you. Like, that's just how it works. I'm not here I'm not making money off of this. So don't expect you to make more money off of this. But,
so for us, I think it's like, what's interesting to us, like if I think somebody's great, then I want them on my podcast, or if I know somebody's been through something that would be a good story or a good topic, I want you on my podcast. So yeah, people who reach out to me, unless they really have, like, if I know them, I'm just not cool with the stranger danger aspect of it, especially if they're coming to my house. You're really good about this technology stuff. I don't ever do anything like that, but yeah. So, it kind of limits you a little bit, but
I guess that does help me in a regard, because I have all of the equipment and I can do all of the things that, like, the interviews are a lot easier for me to do this way. I haven't had like an in-person one since probably like episode 5 or 6 of my podcast, but that was because I was right before COVID happened. But yeah, the idea of, hey, I want you on my show because I find you interesting and I just want to talk with people. That's half the things. And I like slide in people's DMs all the time, and it's just like, hey, awkward me here. Just want to see if you want to talk with me. And, luckily I have a pretty enough face that people at least click the button and look at the message. I'm like, oh, he's not a stalker. That's fine. But it's not always the easiest, and especially with topics and stuff too, right? With the show like mine of, purpose and intentionality and this kind of thing, you can only beat a dead horse so many times, right? Like, how am I going to refresh this in a way that brings, I don't want to just do it to do it. So if I'm going to be talking about something, I want it to be something that's going to kind of resonate with people. And honestly, I've said this before, it's like, it's really my therapy as well. It gives me a reason to kind of talk through ideas and that sort of thing.
I get that. I'm the same way. And I always feel like I'm such an open book. And so if people are like, I want to ask you something, but you don't have to answer if you don't want to, I'm like, oh, lay it on me. I'll tell you anything.
Let's have these.
I don't have anything to hide. Learn from all my mistakes, please.
All right, Kelly, since you said that, we're going to go to Google. No, I'm just kidding. 10 questions never to ask anybody. No.
No, it's fine.
Yeah, I think I don't know. I think it's super cool kind of what you're doing with your family and kind of how that interaction happens. How does your older son kind of feel about it? Is he just like, yeah, it's not my thing anyways, I don't want to be there? Or has he been on the show or?
Yeah. So my other son is AJ, and he was on an episode not that long ago. He really did good because he is also like really quiet. And I was like, you really got to talk in the mic, all the little things. And he did. And so I just like made a bunch of questions for him and I just gave them to him to like, think about. And I was so proud of like how prepared he came and how much he did talk, and it was really cute. So I think he was excited to participate. But
awesome.
He's super athletic and plays basketball. And my other son, McCoy, is not athletic. He's way more like creative mind, artsy. So I was hoping this would kind of help bring him into that versus my other son. He has no problems with anything. He's just getting along just fine.
Love that. It's weird how kind of just talking to strangers on the internet, because that's really what we're doing, how that kind of helps you grow in a way, because I'm ridiculously introverted, and between kind of doing things at my church and my podcast, I've been able to like just learn better skills of how to talk to people. I have to reach out to people, and we have to kind of do that little rigmarole to figure out, scheduling, yada, yada, yada. And then we have to have a conversation for 45 minutes. And it's helped me understand like, hey, this is how you should be communicating with people. This is how you kind of get out of your shell and learn new things, where honestly, most times I'd rather just be sitting on the couch right there, just playing video games. But I'm like, no, you gotta break out of your shell, because this is how you're actually going to grow. And I'm sure you've probably seen that in McCoy as well, of himself kind of growing through that journey of going through this process with the podcast.
My favorite thing is like how much his voice has changed, because he started when he was like, I don't know, 12 or 11. Well, anyway, he's definitely went through puberty since we started, and now he has a deep voice. So it's kind of funny to look back and be like, oh my gosh, you sounded like such a little kid.
Yeah. Now he's just got this like radio voice. You're like, you've got it. You've made it.
So, a lot of people are like, his voice changed. I'm like, it did.
Yeah, now you have actual proof of it. There's documented proof on the internet of like, no, we can go back a year and we can see it's different now. That's funny.
And so that's another thing is like, I always wait for him to be like, Mom, I don't want to talk about that on the podcast. I don't want to be on the podcast, because I feel like when I think I'm older than you, but when I was a kid, kids were really mean. And I think now kids are really accepting of others' differences. And so I think that's come a really long way, and that's really impressive, because he's like, I'm not embarrassed. I don't care. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, because that would be I could see that. Yeah, growing up, it was one of those things you were always worried about how things would be perceived. And that's probably a more generational thing of how we wanted to make sure we were living up to the expectations of those that were kind of interacting with us. And we wanted to make sure that we didn't put anything out there that would embarrass us or do those kinds of things. Luckily for me, people made fun of me for anything anyway. So I kind of embraced it. And it's hard to make fun of somebody that like leans into it. Right.
Yeah.
You'd be like, no, I'm leaning into it. You're just like, oh, wait a second. It's not hurting them. I'm like, no, it doesn't bother me. So I'll make fun of myself too. It's also self-deprecating, not healthy at all. Probably a cause of a lot of other issues, but it helps from the getting made fun of.
So, I just wanted to talk about how we actually like quote unquote met.
Yeah.
Because I think this is a cute story. So my husband was asking me like, what state does this guy live in? And I'm like, I think he lives in Ohio now, but maybe it's New York. I don't even know, but you did live in Minnesota.
Yep.
And I found you because I was following like Minnesota podcasts, Minnesota podcasters. Like, I want to meet these people, because people would say to me like, oh, you have a podcast. Everybody has a podcast. And I'm like, I don't know anyone personally who has a podcast. I'm like, I'm going to meet these people. What are they talking about? And so then that's why I met with you, and you are a runner. I am not a runner. I've tried to be a runner, and every time I do, I just get injured. I've had so much sciatica and foot problems, and I'm like, I give up on the running, but I'm inspired that you do.
I'm a little bit of crazy, but yeah, it was interesting because we had talked about like, hey, we're both in Minnesota. Maybe we do something in person. We can figure this whole thing out. And then that's when my whole job situation, everything changed. So then we ended up having to move. And I was like, well, that kind of stinks, because that would have been fun. And then literally for the last 6 months, I've been trying to figure out a date on my end, nothing on your schedule. It was just like, hey, when does this work? When can I actually fit this thing in? Being in a 1-bedroom apartment now, I have to wait for the missus to be gone so I can actually record.
Yeah.
But don't tell anyone it's the middle of the day and I should be working right now.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Shit, I should have edited that out. No. But I think that's where this like relationship and this podcast, and I'm sure you're doing this as well as you have guests come on. It's kind of helping us grow and meet other people of different backgrounds, cultures, ideas, and just really give us an opportunity to kind of talk to other people. And I think that's why podcasting is so cool, because I always joke when people are like, oh, you have a podcast? I'm like, I'm a white dude in his mid-30s. Of course I have a podcast. That's like a thing that I'm required to do, I think. I also have, Nikes or, whatever. I wear joggers all the time, whatever the case may be. Yeah. Silly millennials. But we were able to kind of meet people and have conversations with people that we normally wouldn't be, to your same point. A lot of people have podcasts, but I don't know many people personally that do, other than the guests I've had on my show. And I think podcasting since the pandemic really turned into this. A lot of comedians have doing, a lot of talk show hosts kind of went this route. And because of it, it's kind of elevated it to a status where it's like, now the only people that listen to podcasts, like the only good podcasts to listen to, are famous people. Right. And I think
I hate that.
It's the worst. I mean, we're famous in our own right.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting because we can still have conversations with, we'll call it the common man, common woman, right? I want to hear your story. Everyone has a story, and I just want to hear your story. Like, tell me about you, because your story matters just as much as, like Joe Rogan or Dax Shepard or any of these like huge podcasters. It's like, yeah, we're doing this because we actually are looking to build the community. We're looking to inspire people with the things that we have to say, or inform people on specific topics, and then meet people along the way. I'm right there with you. I search hashtags like no other. Every time I do a marathon, I'm like, what was the hashtag of this race? Let me click it. I'm going to go through people's Instagrams and be like, hey, they got a really cool story. Let me reach out. 50% of the time people ignore me, but the other 50% I get to have good conversations.
Mm-hmm. And I just feel like there's so many people who are willing to talk about their story that was a difficult time, because time does help you talk about it. Yeah. I just interviewed this friend of mine, and she had a stillbirth baby at like 27 weeks. Nobody knows what to say to that. Nobody knows what's the right thing to do, what's the wrong thing to do, what you want, what you don't want. And so like being able to talk about that, I don't even know the right word. It's not amazing, but it's an honor for that person to tell you their story. But I also think it's like so nice to be able to listen to something like that and know what to do if that happens to somebody that because it's such a terrible thing. Yeah. And everyone's like, we don't know what to say. Yeah.
We don't know how to react in that situation. I've had a guest like that. I had a lady I met on a race in, I think it was West Virginia. That's where we were at. And it was like her first, I don't know if she ran the full or the half, whatever the case might be. But I reached out to her just like, hey, I want to hear your story, because she had her son is autistic, he's on the spectrum, and but very high functioning, was going to college, like doing all these things. I'm like, I want to hear this, because my godmother, her son is autistic and is high functioning as well. It interests me just how families kind of interact in that manner. Didn't realize that she was a victim of domestic violence as well. And that's where the topic turned. And it's like, literally, it was one of those episodes where I just basically shut up for almost the entire thing. I'm like, you tell your story and you talk, and I'm just going to listen and learn of how the things to look out for, how to interact and how to do these things. Because I don't know this, and I don't have the answers. And I think we have to, as hosts and really as people, we should be doing this, is we just need to be able to have empathy and just shut our mouths and listen to people and just say, hey, I hear you. I don't know what you went through. I will probably never have that experience, but I can feel where you're at right now and learn how to help from that situation.
Yeah. There's a lot of people who just want to be heard. And I think it's also like therapeutic for them to get their story out when it's something that personal.
Yeah.
I don't know what else to say to that, but yeah, so it is good. And like you said, everyone does have a story. This is what I do. Whenever people are like, oh my gosh, I have to tell you what happened. I'm like, do you want to tell it on the podcast? It's like my new line. Do you want to come? Great story. Want to put it on the podcast?
Want to come on the podcast?
Yeah.
I do that with guests a lot of times when, like, if someone I don't really know or haven't been following or that sort of thing, I'm like, don't tell me anything about you now. I want to hear it all on the air. I want to feel it. I want to be in the moment and have this reaction. Sometimes it hasn't worked out well. I'm like, they bring it and I was just like, well, that was a dud. No one's going to listen to this episode. But sometimes, I went on Reddit, it was probably 2 years ago now, and literally just was like, hey, who wants to be on a podcast? Who has a story? And I got a bunch of people, and
they all do on Reddit.
Oh yeah, they have some stories. I had to filter through some of them, but yeah, it was one of those, like, the people I had on, I was just like, it's interesting. But again, it's one of those where I don't mind putting myself out there and having a platform to be able to have someone to share their story that maybe they don't think that it's something that they'd be able to share otherwise. And like you said, it could be therapeutic for them too, just to have the conversation. And yeah, I don't know. I like just being able to have the platform to have that conversation with people. Mm-hmm. But I don't have anything else really to chat about. Do you have anything else on your mind? What's going on?
Today, I have the day off. Woo-hoo. It's really exciting. I had a meeting at my son's school this morning. Glad that's over. I had to go to the dentist. Glad that's over. And have this meeting with you that I was, like, actually nervous about, because this is the first time I've ever been a guest on a podcast. So it's a little bit different being in the other seat.
It is. It sucks. It's the worst.
And then I'm on another podcast tonight. So I collect Pyrex. And so I'm doing a podcast with a girl who does a podcast about Pyrex. So I'm going to talk about all of my old lady collection with her. So
that is,
it's been a busy day.
Fantastic. Yeah. That's why podcasts is so great, because there's so many just, like, random things that you're just like, someone has a podcast about that. You're just like, yeah. And it's awesome. And I love every second of it.
Yeah. I know, it's cool. It is cool to hear what other people want to listen to too.
Yeah.
So
it's one of those. I would say it's one of those things where, again, podcasting can be this. A lot of people think of just like interviews and kind of stories and comedians, because that's kind of taken over with a lot of it. But it is another just like good, useful piece of information where, there's a lot of podcasts that are like 5-10 minutes and they're daily or weekly that are just like, hey, here's just some inspiration for your day, or here's just a cool story, or here's just something I'm sharing. And I always try to tell people, if anyone ever shows interest in, like, starting a podcast or do whatever, I go, let me know, I'll help you. I'll tell you all the things you need to do. Like, I literally have an Amazon wish list that I send people of, like, hey, you want a basic podcast setup?
Oh, that's a good idea.
Here's your wish list. Just buy these things and I will show you how to use them. Or if you don't have money, we can use your iPhone and we can make it work and it'll be perfectly fine as well. I think trying to reduce those barriers for people, like, if you have a story to tell, I want to help you in any way that I can to do that. And that's why I like having guests on that have other things like you and your show. It's like, yeah, I'm going to promote the hell out of your show. We're going to post a ton of videos about this. We're going to repost things because that to me is how I can give back in a way with the platform. I have all of this equipment because I've had clients that have, been very generous. So I've been able to buy all these nice things. And because I can buy these nice things, I want to kind of give it back in some way or another, because this life isn't about me. It's how I can kind of serve and help others. So.
Yeah. Well, I love what you're doing. I've listened to every single episode of yours. I can tell you that, because I was like, oh, I should listen to any episodes I haven't heard. And I was like, oh, I've listened to all of them.
I love that. Even the shitty ones. There's lots of shitty ones. There's a lot where you're just like, he's just ranting for no reason.
I'm not saying that that's you, but I've definitely had that as well, so I understand how you feel. But
yeah, what's one of those?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, so it's been a blessing getting to know you. Your voice is so calming. I love listening to it. You are motivating. I think that you are being successful with what you're trying to accomplish with your podcast. And I think it's lovely.
I appreciate that. The check's in the mail, so you'll get that. Thank you for that feedback. But yeah, I thanks again for just taking the time today and kind of chatting. I know we were all over the place, kind of talking a little bit about your story, but I think it's great just to hear what other people are doing, and the stuff you're doing. Your podcast is hilarious. I have another flight tomorrow back to Ohio, and I have a couple episodes already queued up. So I'm excited to be laughing on the plane and people looking at me like, what the hell is this dude's problem? I'm like, man, guys gotta check out this podcast.
Check
You ever heard
this
this
out.
podcast?
Check this out. Yeah.
I'll just airdrop it to everybody on the plane. Like, who is this guy sending me things? That's a fun trick. I did that at a Vikings game once.
I've never thought of that. That's awesome.
Oh, I did it at a Vikings game for my hangry stuff that I had, where it literally in between quarters, I would just pull up like a hangry QR code and like our website, and I would just hit airdrop, and whoever came up, I was just like click, and just like sent every random people pictures. Some people declined it, but some people accepted it. I was like, well, first off, that's not secure. You really shouldn't accept things from strangers.
But thank you.
But
I'm glad you did.
But also thank you for doing that, and support those that are living with the issue of hunger. It's fun.
Yes. It's for a good cause.
Exactly. But yeah, thanks again for kind of taking the time today. I hope people are inspired by this of like, hey, I want to have these conversations with my kids, my family, my spouse, anyone, talk about these taboo things, make it happen, and check out your podcast. Do you guys release weekly?
Mostly, weekly-ish. Life happens sometimes, so we don't push anything out if we're not ready to push it out. We want to be in the good mind frame and make sure we do have content to talk about. So check out On Our Best Behavior. You can find it wherever you listen to podcasts. Perfect. Love it. To everyone else, reach out to me on social media everywhere at flores.run. Subscribe, leave a review for the podcast. That's how people like Kelli get to find it and be like, hey, this isn't too bad. But it's great. Thanks so much for joining me today. Remember to keep running with purpose, one step at a time. See you guys next week.